So as you all know, healthcare marketing is always changing. As more and more transactions are moving online, consumers are turning to digital now more than ever, especially in this post-pandemic world that we live in. And as the world becomes more digital, the number of ways to reach consumers is also growing. The competition in these spaces is getting a lot higher. So deciding where to allocate your marketing dollars for maximum effectiveness is becoming even more important. So if we look at the patient journey conversion funnel, as healthcare marketers, we tend to be very good at measuring top of funnel and mid funnel activity. Things like impressions and clicks are very easy to measure, but unfortunately, they don't tell us a lot. We don't know whether those actions actually resulted in revenue for our organization and whether those dollars were well spent. So as the consumer moves further down the funnel, those metrics get more and more meaningful because those are actions that are closer to the point of care. But unfortunately, they also get more and more difficult to measure because those activities are often happening offline, or our systems just aren't set up to measure that whole funnel. We often see what I call a data drop-off between select and schedule and care phases. And it's this drop-off that really makes it near impossible to tie our efforts to ROI. Being able to measure and prove effectiveness of marketing efforts is really a common problem that we see among healthcare marketers today. Every year, we at Geometric here conduct a healthcare digital marketing survey, and year after year, the inability to measure effectiveness or ROI is one of the top barriers to success. Our most recent 2021 survey was no different, being the second highest barrier. Getting to meaningful measurement is a huge barrier to overcome. And in our survey, the top reasons that were cited for the inability to measure effectiveness or ROI are a lack of tools or infrastructure to support this measurement, followed by the lack of expertise. Now, these are valid reasons and not easy to overcome, but it is possible to remove these barriers and achieve more effective, meaningful measurement and more evidence-based decision-making. This might not mean spot-on ROI figures for every marketing initiative that you have, but I am confident that you can get closer with meaningful metrics, probably closer than you are today, and in some cases actually achieve ROI measurement. So today I am going to walk you through how you can overcome 3 of the biggest hurdles to attaining meaningful measurement. We will touch on issues related to a lack of infrastructure, and hopefully you'll also walk away with more expertise. My goal is to help you make the most of what you have to work with today. So let's start with hurdle number 1, a lack of attribution. Before we can even get close to measuring ROI, we have to have some foundational structures in place, and one of those is attribution. Simply put, attribution is understanding which specific marketing channels or campaigns or efforts are driving revenue. In other words, the channels that you attribute success to. In this example here, you'll see that the customer had touch points across multiple channels prior to conversion. Digital audio and display ads were successful at generating initial awareness. They later engaged with content on Facebook, leading them to subscribe to the email newsletter. These emails generated top-of-mind awareness so that when they searched online for care, they clicked on the ad for that organization and scheduled an appointment. With a proper tracking and measurement strategy in place, we can understand and evaluate the value of each of these marketing channels. You could take it a step further and kind of play with different attribution models, which changes the amount of weight that you might give to each touch point that the user had, but that's a conversation for another time. The key point that I want to make is that without attribution, you are operating blind, which is ineffective when you need to make decisions about how to best allocate your marketing dollars. Now, there's 3 reasons why you might struggle with attribution. The first one is that the marketing source data just doesn't exist. it never existed to begin with. So there's nothing to reference when it comes to attributing success. The second is that the data does exist, but the labeling of that data is vague or disorganized. You can attribute success to something, but it's not really actionable. And the third is that your data is lost. The data once existed, maybe it was labeled well, but somewhere within the user's journey, that data dropped off. Let's dive into each of these to explore common causes and some solutions that you can put in place to improve your data integrity. Let's start with the problem that your marketing source data doesn't exist. The most common reason for a lack of data is that we're simply using channels where measurement is more difficult and that marketing source data isn't established by default, such as offline channels. Another cause might be that the user is coming from a source that just can't be identified. Puts from sources like PDFs, for example, or what we call dark social, such as messaging apps. These often result in being labeled as kind of a vague term like direct, because Google or your analytics platform that you're using just simply doesn't know. So what are some solutions for these? In the case of offline channels, we need to be very strategic in how we identify those sources. You might start by simply creating a dedicated landing page and funneling the traffic to that page from that specific source. And this can help you better identify those particular users coming from your offline campaign. This may also include creating a vanity URL, which is a short URL that is easy for people to remember and type into their browser. And this URL typically redirects to a longer existing URL. Another key component to identifying marketing sources is adding UTM parameters to your URLs whenever possible. These are going to be parameters or tags that you add on to the end of a URL that indicates the marketing source, and this label is passed into your analytics platform that allows you to attract engagement that's stemming from that particular source. Now, if you're using a vanity URL, I recommend having that redirect to a URL with those parameters added, because then you have that offline source well tagged within analytics. When it comes to some of those sources that can't be identified, such as PDFs or dark social, applying UTM parameters to those links, such as your social sharing buttons or high value PDF links, might help alleviate some of that non-identifiable traffic. Lastly, consider using phone call tracking solutions. Now, your call center technology might have the ability to create a dedicated phone number for campaigns that you can track, or you can look into third-party systems like CallRail, for example. Now, these do have a cost, but it is a small price to pay to understand how well your tactics are working. The second problem you may have with attribution is that your marketing source data exists, but it's very vague or disorganized, so it's hard to get insights from and take action on. The first cause for this might be that you just aren't being specific enough in your tagging of your UTMs. If you're using a term like campaign, but you have several ongoing campaigns, that isn't going to be very helpful. Secondarily, even if we are getting specific with our tagging, if it isn't being formatted consistently, it can result in a mess because that data will be fragmented in your analytics platform. So if one URL is labeled as email, all caps, and the next is labeled email, capital E, and the next is all lower caps, these are all going to appear as separate instances in your analytics rather than all being bucketed together, which will be difficult and time-consuming when it comes to assessing that data. Solutions for this are to create tagging guidelines or taxonomy so that you have established naming conventions for each campaign or marketing initiative. This can help you avoid some of the vague or inconsistent labeling. But you might need to take it a step further and use some tools that can help you with your data governance. Now, if you're a small team or you're just getting started with this, or you don't have a lot of ongoing campaigns, you might be able to get away with a spreadsheet. You can get fancy with the formulas that help generate those tag URLs pretty quickly. But if you're a bigger team, juggling a lot of campaigns, consider using online tools to reinforce your established tagging rules and naming conventions. With these tools, you can generate tagged URLs based on pre-populated variables and rules that are set up on the back end. And this allows you to enforce certain naming conventions or formatting. Now, there are a lot of options out there. These are just a couple examples that you can check out as a starting point. And just another note, when it comes to these naming conventions, make sure that you're sharing these with your vendors if you establish some kind of taxonomy or governance. It's important that everyone is on the same page as far as how things should be labeled and named, because it can really affect your analytics on the back end. The third reason you may lack attribution is because your marketing source data was lost. Maybe in the beginning you had that source data established, it was labeled well, but at some point during the user journey, that data dropped off. Now, there are several things that may cause this. The most common situation is that a user has crossed domains and the data wasn't retained during that jump. So if you have multiple websites that the user may visit during their journey, this could be a problem for you. Your user journey is going to be broken, so you're not getting the full funnel view and able to attribute success to your initial marketing source. Another cause might be that the URL you have tagged with UTM parameters redirects to another URL. Redirects often strip out UTM parameters, so you might be losing that source data. A third cause would be that you're using UTM parameters improperly, such as using them to track clicks on internal links on your site, rather than to attribute a marketing source. Now, the problem with applying UTM parameters to internal links is that it starts a new session in your analytics. So you're breaking that user journey into two pieces. Yes, you can use them to track clicks. It does work, but you will jeopardize that attribution because the source now becomes whatever parameters were in that link. You can't look back to that original marketing source because the journey is broken. So let's talk about some solutions to these. The first solution is, when possible, where it makes sense, implement cross-domain tracking. Cross-domain tracking ties two or more sites together as one, so you can look at the complete user journey across both sites. Now, this does mean that there's more data to look at and it can be messier, so I would recommend setting up a separate analytics property so you can also look at them individually. Another solution is to manage the use of your redirects. Be mindful of redirecting any URLs that might be in use and have UTMs appended, because those redirects could break that traffic. And lastly, use event tracking to track clicks on internal links versus relying on UTMs. You'll have just as valuable data, if not more, and you won't be jeopardizing your marketing attribution. So what are some next steps that you can take? Start by conducting an analytics audit to evaluate your data integrity. Look for some of those things that we talked about. How are your data sources labeled? Are there a lot of fragmented instances or vague terms? What are some marketing sources that you don't have tracked today but should? Once you've conducted your audit, create a measurement plan and implement guidelines or taxonomy for your marketing channels. Lastly, identify holes where your source data may be lost and implement measures to avoid that data loss. So now that we have our source data established, we need to make sure that it's retained throughout the patient journey. And that leads us to hurdle number 2, connecting data between systems. We just talked about the importance of having that marketing source data established, but you need that data carried through every touch point of the user's journey. And this often includes different types of technology. These systems don't talk to each other by default. We have to work to connect those pipes to measure as far down the funnel as possible. Full funnel measurement is very difficult when you're trying to connect data across a complex digital ecosystem. I'm going to break this down into steps that you can take to start connecting those pipes and achieving full funnel measurement. And I'm going to frame this in the context of online appointment scheduling, but this approach does apply to other systems as well. The first step is to map out the user journey to determine which systems need to connect for full funnel measurement. So what kinds of systems might we be working with? The user journey will always begin with your marketing source. From there, the next touch point might be your website CMS. You may have a separate provider or location directory. Then you have your online scheduling software, which may be built into your directory or your EMR. And then you have the EMR itself. Finally, you have the output, some way to visualize that data. So you can see there are a lot of systems that you might be working with, a lot of places where that data might drop off. After mapping out your user journey, the next step is to identify where your current data drop-offs are. This is going to be places where the data isn't being transferred from one system to the next. So rather than seeing the entire user journey from marketing source to conversion, your data is fragmented and you are only able to see pieces of the puzzle. Once you've identified these drop-offs, you can then take the steps needed to connect the pipes. To do this, you will need to investigate the capabilities of each system for sending and or receiving that marketing source data. And I'm not going to lie, this is hard work. This is going to be highly dependent on the vendors you're using, the platforms, how willing they are to work with you, how well they understand the concept of marketing data. And this stuff can be just very time consuming. The things that you'll need to research are what type of data can we pass to that system? How can it be passed? Are there specific requirements for how it needs to be formatted? Your first instinct might be to start at the top, at the beginning of the user journey, but often the most limiting system is likely to be your EMR. So I would actually recommend starting at the bottom, understanding that system first, and then working backwards up the funnel from there. Once you've done your research, take the time to sit down and create a detailed plan and get all parties, both internal and external, on board with that plan. With this type of project, there are a lot of people involved, a lot of moving parts, and a lot of important technical details to manage. So if you skip this step, things can derail very quickly. You may have a lot of miscommunication and things could just take much longer. So take the time now to create a detailed shared plan so that you can save time later. What this might look like is just a document. It can be simple. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It should include a summary of the problem, so there's a shared understanding of what the goal is, an outline of the proposed solution. This is where a visual might also be helpful to show a map of the steps in the user journey and the systems involved. It should also include the technical requirements so that the development teams understand exactly what's required of them. All of that research you conducted in the previous step, that's where this comes into play. It's also helpful to include a few example scenarios. So if the user does this, goes here, clicks that, this is what should happen. Lastly, outline each party's roles and responsibilities. And you might want to include a timeline as well if you have one. Once your plan is finalized, you can move on to execution and testing. And this is where you're putting in place the necessary tracking, development work, and rounds of testing. It may be helpful to set up recurring weekly touch points to have time saved on everyone's calendars as an opportunity for everyone to ask and answer questions, troubleshoot issues, make decisions. Once the tracking is in place, check regularly to ensure data quality, as there are likely to be kind of odd quirks and things that were initially missed. There might be certain pages or aspects of a website that might be embedded or coded differently that the tracking just isn't working well with. So these are opportunities to further troubleshoot and refine the tracking. The last step is to create reports to visualize data for decision making. Now, the type of data available is going to be heavily dependent on your EMR. Depending on the capabilities of your system, this might be the one part of the funnel that you do have to manually pull data for. Ideally, with this data, you'll be able to create a performance marketing report that enables you to make decisions based on meaningful metrics and the efforts that are driving your organization forward. These might be metrics around overall marketing funnel performance, revenue and cost breakdowns, revenue by specialty, or by new versus existing patients to the system. Now, I want to walk through a real-world example of what it looks like to actually work through these steps and overcome hurdles to get the full funnel measurement for online appointment scheduling. So with this particular client, we started by mapping out the user journey to identify all the systems we needed to connect. The journey always starts with that initial marketing source. Now, this client in particular was investing a lot of advertising with Google Ads. So one of the goals of this project was to see how well that investment was paying off. The next step in the journey was the website CMS, which is currently on VitalSite. We then have an additional step because they have a separate provider directory through Yext. Now, this added some complexity because not only is it another system to connect, but it's also an additional entry point within the user journey that we had to account for. So that added some additional development work down the line as well. Within the provider directory, we then have an embedded online scheduling widget, which was through their Epic EMR. And finally, we have the data visualization component. Once we mapped out the journey, we identified 3 places where that data was dropping off. These were between the VitalSite CMS and Yext provider directory, between the provider directory and Epic, and finally from Epic to the marketing report visualization. Before creating a plan to connect those pipes, we had to identify the technical requirements of each system for sending and receiving that marketing source data. And as I mentioned, it's beneficial to start towards the end of the pipeline with your EMR and work your way backwards. So with Epic, they require that the marketing source must be passed via a URL parameter. So knowing that that was the context we had to work within, we identified several requirements for how we could implement this. The first was that we had to identify and populate the marketing source within the URL. And not only populate it, but retain it throughout the entire user journey. And lastly, that data had to be combined into a single parameter because Epic only allows one. So once we understood this, we could create a detailed plan so that there was a shared understanding of the problem and the steps needed to solve it. And this consisted of a diagram similar to what you're looking at here, and shared documents between Geometric, Yext, Epic, and the client. There were also many conversations and working sessions alongside that. Once we had all parties on board, we were able to move forward with implementing the plan. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the requirements was that the source data had to be passed via URL parameters. So from the onset, as soon as the user arrives on the site, we have to detect that marketing source and put it into those parameters. Sometimes those parameters already exist if you're coming from an ad and there were already UTMs attached to that link, so that makes it really easy. But often the parameters don't exist, so if they're coming from an organic search, for example, so we had to find a way to detect that source and generate parameters based on where they're coming from if they didn't exist already. We then had to retain that data throughout the entire journey on the site, because the way that parameters work is that as soon as the user navigates to another page, those parameters are stripped from the URL. So to do this, we set a session cookie that would retain the data throughout their journey on the site. Then once the user exited the site to the provider directory, we would access the data held in that cookie, regenerate those parameters, which would pass the data over to Yext. We then have a similar scenario where that data has to be retained throughout the user's journey on the provider directory, as well as identifying the source of any users who are entering the pipeline at this point. Now, because Epic can only accept a single parameter of data, those UTM parameters of source, medium, campaign had to be combined into a single parameter. We can still understand the source, medium, campaign, but they're combined into a single string, which is fed into Epic. From Epic, they can then export that data into a spreadsheet, which can be imported into a visualization tool like the Google Data Studio. And with this data, they're able to view marketing performance broken down into completed appointments, new versus existing patients to the system, and revenue figures. So you can see at this point how some of those foundational aspects of attribution that we talked about earlier are so important. Because if your data isn't clean or labeled well, or if you aren't tagging your offline sources, these reports would be meaningless. So get that foundation in place, and then when you connect these pipes, your data will be extremely powerful. And that leads us to our last hurdle. Hurdle number 3, achieving offline measurement. Due to the nature of healthcare, even if you have all of your online measurements set up and functioning perfectly, there are still going to be cracks in your funnel. And that's because, unfortunately, a lot of scheduling takes place offline. Tracking this bottom of funnel activity takes a lot of manual effort, so it's very difficult to do across the board. The key is to start small, and then over time, you can identify opportunities to expand upon and scale those efforts. So I'll be walking through the steps that you can take to undertake offline measurement, and I'll also walk through a real-world example of the success that one of our clients, Concord Hospital, has had in calculating ROI through offline efforts. As a first step, identify a high-value campaign that you can start with. Now, the benefit to starting with a single campaign is that you can focus your efforts on specific high-revenue areas. And that's important because tracking offline activity takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, so you want it to be worth your time. Another benefit is that you know exactly what you're spending, which of course is a necessary part of the equation. You also have a lot more control, so you can more easily identify and attribute the campaign as a source and set specific trackable conversion points that you can funnel the traffic to. Lastly, it's easier to attain revenue figures because it's so specific to one service, procedure, etc., whatever your campaign is focused on. Now, this is a tactic that one of our clients, Concord Hospital, they're based in New Hampshire, they have used over the years to measure ROI by starting small and then scaling their approach to cover many high-value campaigns. Most recently, they have focused on promoting their new cardiovascular institute. They worked with us to create a digital campaign to generate awareness and attract new patients through a mix of display and paid social channels. The advertising creative and copy focuses on different aspects of the Cardiovascular Institute, things like provider expertise, the institute's capabilities, patient support, or the potential to improve quality of life. After you've identified your high-value campaign, we then need to make sure that we're laying those critical foundational pieces that we talked about earlier. This means establishing your marketing source data by using UTM parameters and that your data is retained through to the point of conversion. We also need trackable conversion points. Some of the most common, of course, are a dedicated landing page with a form or a trackable phone number. The ads for Concord Hospital's cardiovascular campaign funneled users to a dedicated landing page that was used only for that campaign. And that page really highlighted one of their patients' success stories. There were only 2 actions that users could take on that page. They could either call a phone number or they could fill out a form to request an appointment. And so these are conversion points that we could easily track, which was critical to evaluating the success of the campaign. The form, of course, is the easiest conversion to track through to ROI. For the phone number, we were only able to track clicks, so we weren't able to get the full funnel ROI from those who chose to call. That is certainly doable through phone tracking solutions, but we didn't have those particular resources for this campaign. But we do have an understanding of who scheduled appointments via the form. Once you've planned your campaign and you have those foundational pieces in place, you then need to identify and connect with internal resources that can assist you with the offline measurement piece. Now, this is going to look different depending on your particular organization's operations and the specifics of your campaign. But in general, there are two roles that you will need to connect with and gain the support of. The first is an individual in a more patient-facing role who is involved with scheduling. This may be someone like a patient coordinator or a patient navigator. The goal of working with this individual is to gain visibility to that bottom of funnel activity so that you can measure success. So attaining data on the number of appointments scheduled and the number of completed appointments, as well as understanding who might be a new versus existing patient. For Concord Hospital's cardiovascular campaign, our client sought the assistance of a cardiology practice patient coordinator and the support of their manager. The patient coordinator was on board with contacting the leads from the campaign and maintaining a list of those appointments. Once this person has agreed to support you, you'll need to create a workflow and communication plan that allows you to track held appointments. So for the cardiovascular campaign, every time the lead generation form was submitted, our client would download a spreadsheet with the new lead and email it to the practice coordinator, who would then contact the lead to schedule an appointment and make a note in the spreadsheet as to when the lead was scheduled and whether they were an existing patient. She then reported back monthly on how many leads resulted in new patient appointments. So at the end of the campaign, we had a list of leads generated and a more refined list of new patient appointments that were held. And those are the first numbers that are necessary for calculating ROI and determining the campaign success. The second resource you need to identify is an individual in your finance department who can help you get the revenue numbers needed to calculate ROI. This might be someone like a financial analyst, for example. Your goal in working with this individual is to identify a dollar amount for whatever the end goal of your campaign is. So if the goal is to drive new patient acquisition to its service, this may be the estimated dollar value for each new patient. Our client at Concord Hospital worked with her senior financial analyst to request a dollar amount for new cardiology patients. He had to provide criteria for how a new cardiology patient was defined and what practices or cost centers are included in the Cardiovascular Institute. And with that, the analyst was able to come up with a dollar value for a new patient. With that dollar amount and the bottom of funnel metrics, your last step is to calculate ROI for the campaign and evaluate success. So was the campaign successful? If multiple channels contributed, which channel was the most successful? By understanding ROI, you can confidently answer these questions and make decisions about where to allocate future spend. Over the duration of just 3 months, Concord Hospital spent $22,000 on their staff, and they gained over $100,000 in net revenue. That's a 450% return on investment. And they saw success across both channels that we use, both display and the paid social. But in particular, we found the paid social to be even more valuable, largely because a lot of community members saw the ads, knew the physician or had experience with that particular physician, and left comments on those ads, which further kind of spurred that organic reach. Now, because we were able to see the positive impact on their bottom line, they have continued the campaign, and through continuous testing of ad creative and messaging, they have been able to continue that success and see positive results month over month. Now, before we end our time today, I want to touch on one final topic, and that is managing data privacy. As marketers, we have an abundance of data at our fingertips. But over the last several years, we've seen a big push for users to have more privacy protection and control over their data. And that trend is only going to continue. As of now, 5 states have privacy laws, with many more states preparing to follow. Mismanaging consumer data can have serious consequences for your organization. A most recent example is a report found that hospital websites were gathering visitor data and sharing it with Facebook. In some cases, without disclosing that they were sharing the data or obtaining consent or sending personally identifiable information or protected health information. Meta is now the subject of a class action lawsuit claiming potentially thousands of medical details of hospital patients were shared with Facebook. So how do we avoid privacy catastrophes? Brief disclaimer here, we are not legal advisors. This is just our perspective based on what we understand of practices in the industry today. First of all, connect with your legal and compliance department and work together as strategic partners. This is going to require a level of education on your part to help them understand your marketing strategies, what tools you're using, and what tracking scripts are in place today, their capabilities, and the importance of those tools to your organization. It might be kind of a knee-jerk reaction for them to want to shut everything down and rely on minimal data. So it's important for them to know how it impacts your strategies and your organization's success in these areas, and what are standard practices in the industry today, so that they can appropriately assess the level of risk. Work with your compliance team to ensure that your site's stated privacy policy or terms and conditions align with your practices for collecting, storing, and sharing data, including third parties like Facebook. You have to make sure that the language you're using is clear and accurate, and this may also be an opportunity for you to confirm that you have appropriate business associate agreements with your third-party partners. In addition, assess the data that you are collecting and sending to third parties today, and ensure that they are meeting your compliance policies. Lastly, stay up to date on industry and technology changes. As privacy laws and technology change, you need to remain diligent in ensuring that your privacy policy and practices are in alignment with your organization's compliance policies. Staying up to date on technology changes can also unveil opportunities to leverage new privacy-centric solutions that didn't previously exist. For example, Google Analytics has released a new generation called Google Analytics 4. One of the changes is that it is going to be more privacy-centric than the existing version. One of the changes is that it is going to be a lot more privacy-centric with cookies. It's not going to store IP addresses, and it will offer just more comprehensive, granular controls over the way that data is collected and used. We now know that Google will be sunsetting the current version called Universal Analytics in July of 2023, so just about a year from now. And the reason that this is important to think about now is because there won't be any data continuity from Universal Analytics to Google Analytics 4. So you won't be able to look back in time at your existing data. In order to have a year-over-year comparison, you will need to set up a GA4 property right now. So it's very important to take into consideration. Now, there are many other changes and benefits to Google Analytics 4, which I could go on and on about, but we don't have that much time today. So you can read all of the details and our recommendations on our website at gmetric.com/GA4. Healthcare marketing will always be changing, but hopefully with these tools and tactics that we shared today, you can set yourself up for success by understanding where your marketing dollars are most effective today and in the years to come. Thank you so much.